Greetings. My name is Crystal James, and I have the pleasure of serving as Vice President of External Affairs and General Counsel at Tuskegee University. It is my pleasure to have an opportunity to present information to you today regarding research and ethics, specifically because of the way that I made it to Tuskegee. One of the general things that I've been taught from the mentors that I've had along my journey is that the journey is very important. So I'd like to start this presentation by telling you that I am from rural Georgia, and I am a first-generation college student. I have a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's of public health from Rollins School of Public Health with a concentration in environmental and occupational health, and a law degree from University of Houston Law Center. I've had these degrees since the age of 26, when I also received my license to practice law in the state of Georgia. I tell you all these things, again, not to brag on the things that I was able to accomplish at such a young age, but to, again, share the journey and let you know that the information that I'll provide to you today will be filtered through that lens of experience. I introduce myself in many settings as a public health trained attorney, because even in strictly litigation situations, that is the perspective that I bring to not only the cases that I handle from the university, but also the perspective that I bring to every aspect of life. So I hope that the information and the experience that I'll share with you over the next few minutes will spark something in you and also inspire you to be an advocate and to dispel misinformation about the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. And that will be the starting place for our conversation today. So as promised, and as mentioned before, I am, again, Crystal James. I work for Tuskegee University, and we're going to be talking about ethics and research and the legacy of the syphilis study at Tuskegee and how it has changed ethics and research for the world. The U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee ran from 1932 roughly to 1972. And we are very intentional at Tuskegee University about what we name this and how we refer to the name of this study for a number of reasons. Mainly because many times people refer to the study as a Tuskegee experiment versus the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee. And this is important and significant because the Tuskegee experiment actually did happen, and it was a totally different phenomena, although the only thing that is remembered from the experiment is the syphilis study. I like for you to have a basis for understanding why people from Tuskegee and who matriculate at Tuskegee University will reject that connotation or that nomenclature when you refer to the syphilis study or to the Tuskegee experiment. The photo that you see here is of the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital that was on the campus of Tuskegee Institute. It still remains on the campus of Tuskegee University. However, it is now the Legacy Museum. It is also the birthplace of many Blacks and other minorities that were born in Macon County since the early 20th century. But the Tuskegee experiment was actually a number of different initiatives that were begun by Booker T. Washington and supported and proliferated by scholars such as George Washington Carver, who's very well known, especially for his work in agriculture with the peanuts, and other ways in which he helped to save the farming industry for the United States. But also a part of the Tuskegee experience was the Tuskegee Airmen, which we are proud to be able to start to train the next generation of, beginning with our aviation science program that's coming online this fall. It was also about economic development. And part of the reason that Booker T. Washington was invited to the Atlanta Cotton Exposition was because of this work that was being conducted there. What also flowed from the Tuskegee experience was the National Negro Business League, which is still in operation today, the National Medical Association, and other organizations that were supported and led by Black Americans during that time. It included educational development and, of course, medical training. This was the only site. John A. Andrew Hospital and the VA hospital there in Macon County were the only training sites for African Americans who were interested, in other minority groups who were interested in pursuing health professions during that time. This created what was known as the Negro Health Movement, which has developed into Negro Health Week, where the statistics on not only the health outcomes of Blacks in America were collected by sociologists Monroe Work, but they information on lynchings that actually provided the research basis for the work that is going on in the Legacy Museum at Montgomery and many of the other documents that refer to lynchings that happened in some of the rural states during the Jim Crow era. Now, moving towards the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, one of the things that we did know before the study was started was that there had been significant research on treatments for syphilis that happened around the first decade of the 20th century, where arsenic and mercury had emerged as viable treatment regimens for individuals who were suffering with syphilis. The other important key piece of information for you to know that was happening during this time was the fact that syphilis was a disease that was widespread across the United States. With that in mind, several demonstration projects or treatment programs were set up in key strategic locations around the country, most of which were funded by the Rosenwalds. And these Rosenwald demonstration projects actually enrolled individuals to receive these mercurial as well as arsenic treatments to try to combat the spread of syphilis across the United States. What we understood about the disease progression in the stages of that progression, we had learned from studies that had been conducted, similar to how we get informed about many disease progression stages in the United States today. It is through clinical trials or studies that were conducted in mostly all Caucasian males. And we understood that there were 3 significant stages of syphilis based upon studies that had been conducted in Oslo, Norway, in the population of white men that had described these stages. But the other critical piece that was happening in the scientific field at that time, at the early stages of the 20th century, was a belief in eugenics. And this whole notion that Blacks were inherently inferior, we were more promiscuous, and that diseases did not impact us in the same way in which they impacted our white counterparts. These all kind of set the stage for the study that was to begin after the crash that happened in 1929 to 1930. There was the failure of the stock market and the significant crash that cost many rich philanthropists, that were actually funding these demonstration projects across the country were no longer able to provide that resource. Therefore, they were closed, and those demonstration projects were stopped across the country. However, because of the Tuskegee experiment, again, that's referring back to the economic development, the educational development, which actually set the stage and the parameters for school districts across the country and that are still used today, were all had come out of Tuskegee. There was a hospital there. There was a dedicated pool of physicians that were being trained annually there. And so this actually set up an opportunity when the researchers who were working with the demonstration projects went to the U.S. Public Health Service and the CDC to try to get them to support these treatment programs. They did not identify a resource for that. But what they did say is that, well, since they're not being treated anyway, what we can do is give you some money for a demonstration, for a project, which we would now refer to in our lexicon today as a pilot project. But they said, so this is an opportunity for us to conduct a natural experience, to be able to look at how this disease progresses when untreated in the Negro, to be able to compare it to the data that was found in Oslo. Again, this is in the backdrop of eugenics and a general misinformation that Blacks and other minority groups did not respond or to disease in the same way the white counterparts did. So the subject pool was comprised mostly of illiterate sharecroppers from the Alabama's most impoverished counties. All the subjects were Black. These men were never told they had syphilis. They were told that they were being treated for bad blood. And what you see here is a example of a flyer recruiting subjects for the experiment. And it basically asks, do you have bad blood, which had many different meanings in the community at that time. Another example of the deception used to coerce subjects into the study is this letter. It basically indicates that they have been getting this treatment over time for bad blood through the Rosenwald demonstration projects, and that they also have continued to be treated, even though they were not receiving treatment at the time. They were continuing to meet, to be pulled together on a routine basis and get examinations so that the researchers could document the different stages of disease as it progressed in this study population. And this is part of the sign-up sheets that were used to inform them. At the conclusion of the study, only 74 of the test subjects were still alive. 28 of the men had died directly of syphilis. 100 were dead from related complications, and approximately 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis. Now, when they showed up for the medical attention that they did receive, while they did not treat them for syphilis, they treated them for many other things, like the common cold, other malaise that they may have had during the time period, but they were not given any treatments that had any indication for the syphilis in which they thought they were being treated for. In truth, these doctors had no intention of curing these men of syphilis. They were looking at the natural history of the disease again, and that the ultimate goal was to follow these men through autopsy, in which the researcher promised free burial to get men to continue to participate through the end of life. And this is a quote from one of the doctors in the study. And again, much of this information was taken from the National Archives, which codified and collected many of the documents that were distributed or related to the study during that time period. And it said, as I see it, one of the doctors involved explained, we have no further interest in these patients until they die. Again, they were convincing them to stay in the treatment study, for through death, and they were very successful. There was one actually still on record as the most successful prospective study that has ever been conducted, with only 17% being lost to follow-up during the 40 years of the study. The perpetrators that were involved are listed here for you, not only the individuals, but also the organizations that not only had knowledge, but in some way supported or provided resource to the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. You have Dr. Talaferio Clark, who was a part of the U.S. Public Health Service, Dr. Eugene Dibble, who was the head of the hospital there at Tuskegee, Dr. Oliver Wenger, Dr. Raymond Vandelier, and Dr. John Heller. Also, a lot of emphasis was put on Nurse Eunice Rivers, who was the nurse that was hired specifically to go out and to round the men up each year for a follow-up. And so that when these doctors came down to do these examinations, all the men would be available and come in. Now, one of the some of the misinformation about the study is that it was a secret and that nobody knew that this was happening. That is absolutely untrue. There were many, many publications that were in the literature about what was going on in the study from the very beginning. As you can see here, this is an article that was published in 1936, Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. You had further studies that were conducted and publicized each year about their findings. So while some people want to indicate that Black people in general were kept in the dark about the study, it's absolutely not true. There were many publications and also Blacks that participated in the publishing of these documents. Listed here is a bibliography of some of the syphilis study publications that happened over the lifespan of the study. Now, while at the beginning there was no they later learned that arsenic and mercury weren't, there was not a really good treatment. It actually only had about 30% efficacy in the beginning, but it was something. The men that were in this study were not going to get treatment because it wasn't really anything that was viable, that was available for anyone. But when penicillin became well known as the product of choice to treat syphilis, that is when this study took a much darker turn. And for many, this is the point where the ethics in the research study started to be, the lack of ethics became much more evident in this study. Now, the story finally was broke in the Washington Star on July 25th in 1972 in an article by Jean Heller of the Associated Press. Her source was Peter Buxton, a former Public Health Service venereal disease interviewer. He was considered the whistleblower and the source. However, his source was William Bill Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins was, I'm proud to say, a mentor of mine and helped me to actually discover public health as a career pathway. In 1967, he became one of the first African Americans recruited to the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, and he wanted to be a part of the new era of uniformed services, which the understanding of that time was that public health is a mean to keep Black diseases from infecting white people. That was kind of what most people in the research, according to Dr. Jenkins, felt that public health really meant. But there were people like Dr. Jenkins who understood this to be something different. At the time, when he first learned of the infamous Tuskegee study of syphilis in the Negro male, there was no precedent for an informed consent process or the bioethical review of research. Now, once he got into the public health service, Dr. Jenkins was immediately troubled by the ethics of the situation and spoke to his supervisor about what was going on in the study and his concerns about the ethics. He was told not to worry about it, and later he learned that his supervisor was one of those who were monitoring the study. Dr. Jenkins was a biostatistician. His work to try to end the study was not completely successful, and he was deeply disappointed that he couldn't get anyone within the public health service to pay attention to the issues that he was raising. Still, his experience with confronting the immorality of the study changed his life and sensitized him to the fact that medical research could be biased against people of color. And he actually took the information that he had been gathering in an underground paper that he helped to publish each to other Blacks who were coming into the public health service, called the Drum, to try to get them to band together to try to do something about this unethical study. He was not successful in his efforts initially. And even when he first sent information to local newspapers, because he didn't understand the process of using a press release and how to get the attention of even writers for news stories, he still was unsuccessful, was somewhat discouraged from that process. But in having the opportunity to meet with Peter Buxton and explaining to him and showing him all the data that he had access to as a part of the U.S. Public Health Service, and why he felt like it was unethical and would not happen if these men were not Black, Mr. Buxton then prepared that information into a proper press release, which was then picked up by Jean Heller and again publicized, as mentioned in the previous slide. This led to, as many of you now know, a lawsuit that was filed by Fred Gray, who was one of the leading civil rights attorneys of our time, on behalf of the men. And as a part of that settlement, the CDC were actually pledged to ensure that the men in the study, as the actual cases and controls, were followed to death as originally planned, but not just to follow them for syphilis. They were actually given penicillin and any other medicines that will help them not only with syphilis, but any other illnesses they may had. All of their medical treatment from 1970, late 70s. I'm not going to say directly when the study ended, because there was some hearings that we'll talk about a little bit more that led to this, but any of their medical treatment was picked up by the Centers for Disease Control and the Public Health Service. Prior to retiring from CDC, and one of the critical things that became important to him was understanding that you need more people of color in public health doing this work in order to ensure these types of atrocities, if not prevented, would not be something that people would feel so freely to do, because we would have people of color who were involved and understood the biases and the racism of America to stand up and call attention to these types of atrocities when it became apparent to them. Again, these syphilis victims were, this is a copy of the article that actually went to press, and is prepared here for you. Again, all of this information is still available in the National Archives for you to review, but this is a copy of that work from the National Archives for your review at your convenience. Now, at the conclusion of the study in 1972, after the newspaper articles broke, Senator Kennedy held hearings in Washington on the study at Tuskegee. And listed here are some of the questions that were actually pulled from the transcript of those hearings, where you see some of the questions that were asked by Senator Kennedy and the response from Mr. Pollard, who was one of the named participants in the lawsuit against the U.S. Public Health Service after this time. At the conclusion of those hearings, the Congress acknowledged that the syphilis study was ethically unjustified and called for it to be immediately ended. And the publication that documented this came in 1973, about a year afterward. And they acknowledge at this point, and again, this is the point in the study where most people tend to draw consensus on when it became unethical, was in 1953 when penicillin became widely available. That in these, and it was deliberately withheld from these men who were part of the study. Now, while there were things, we'll talk about some of the legacies that came out, even once the story broke, there were blocked attempts to create central oversight body for the ethical treatment of human subjects because of the concern that it would prohibit the discovery work that could happen if they had rules that govern clinical trials. So even this study and even the finding that it was unethical did not make the Nixon administration immediately move to creating policies that will prohibit this type of behavior in the future. It still took some additional work for that to happen. Again, these are further articles that were that have been published about the study that reference it, and we continue to see it referenced. And I think it was most notably referenced during the COVID pandemic as a reason for people not to participate in the in vaccination projects. And there's actually a video, and I will send the link if there's interest, where descendants of men who were in the study actually made videos through PBS and did a documentary to talk about the distinction between what is now well-known vaccines that were made widely available to all populations to be able to participate. And basically the distinction that they drew for the population, many of whom were referring to this as a reason as to why they would not participate in allow vaccinations to occur with them or their family members, was because of the mistrust and distrust as it related to the Tuskegee studies. However, the real distinction there was the fact that in the Tuskegee studies, treatment was deliberately withheld, and that was not the case with the vaccination. They were actually, once it became more readily available, actually trying to make it available for many populations, which is in direct contrast as to what was happening with the syphilis study. So what are some of the legacies from the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study? One of the really important legacies is the Institutional Review Board. It approves all research on humans. It checks for technical validity, tries to minimize risk to participants, and considers risk in relation to benefits. There are specific guidelines as to what the makeup of the Institutional Review Board, and approval is generally by a simple majority. So the IRBs are reviewed by the federal government. If it finds problems with the IRB, it can order it to cease and desist and have their IRB number removed. Or it could be that they can, if they review that particular study, they can halt the research until further notice or until any potential ethical violations are addressed. Exceptions are made for studies that would be harmful to abrupt stop, but there can be mandates in which the aspects of the study that are considered to be unethical can be mandated to be changed, even if the study is not stopped completely. Another important legacy is the notion and the codification of informed consent and what it requires. It is the capacity to consent as opposed to assent, to agree or concur. You can assent to treatment by not rejecting treatment. So there's not an affirmative consent. It's just an assent. That is, you're not rejecting. But informed consent requires that participants are provided with enough information to make an assessment of the risks or benefits associated with the research, and based upon that information, decide for themselves whether or not they would like to participate. It should never be obtained through coercion, and it must be demonstrated that subjects were made aware of the potential risks, benefits, conditions of participation, and have the ability to withdraw without penalty in order for it to be truly informed consent. If it is not, if consent is not informed, it can be bad, or it it can be as bad as or worse than not getting consent at all. So just because many times people think that informed consent is just having a form with all the information on there and you sign at the bottom. And unfortunately, many times when many of us go in for medical treatment, especially for hospital services and other things, we don't read that informed consent, which usually has very, very tiny font, and you really just want to get your service done. So you don't read all of the things, the potential risk and benefits. You just assume, as we all do, that you're going to have only the positive outcomes that have been indicated to you by your physician, and that none of the negative things will happen to you. But unfortunately, many times people end up, and if we have more time, we could talk about in situations like Henrietta Lacks, where in that informed consent, they not only have agreed to the procedure in which they initially came to the medical provider to get, but they also have agreed to have their cells and samples collected for research purposes as well as for proprietary purposes, if that is there's potential for that. So those are the things that we want to make sure as researchers that you understand, that as you're enrolling individuals into your study, be it even if it's just a needs assessment or for an actual specific medical procedure, you want to be very sure that the individuals that you're enrolling actually give informed consent. And that could mean things like translating that document into several different languages that are appropriate for the community that you're trying to serve. It could be have an assessment of the language used in the informed consent form that will be signed to make sure that the individuals truly understand what's there. And and it also could mean making sure that you not only inform the individual receiving service, but their medical proxy or their health navigator to help make sure that that consent that they're giving is truly informed. Now, there are two types of consent that can be given, direct or substitute. If a person has a legal guardian, they need a substitute. We see this many times when we're talking about children under the age of consent, and that age of consent, it varies per state, but it's generally 18, but in some states for some activities that the age could be as young as 16 to consent. However, if they are not reach the age of majority for that state, the parent or a legal guardian must substitute consent for them, and the informed consent must be received from that guardian. This also can occur when you're dealing with an elderly or a population that may have some cognitive dysfunction that may inhibit their ability to fully understand the potential risk and benefits. In those situations, a substitute is also still needed. And as a leader or a participant on the research team, it is your responsibility to be able to help that person ascertain whether or not they have the capacity to give direct consent, or if a substitute, a third party, may be needed in that process. When in doubt, no matter what the procedure is, always get permission or always get consent. And it should always, always, always be obtained in writing. So these guidelines for informed consent, consider that a subject is at risk. All factors that might influence the willingness of the subject participating in the study must be detailed before informed consent is obtained. And you may detail some of that in writing it, or it could be verbally explained, but you want to make sure that you document in that writing the information that has been provided, as well as an opportunity for them to sign, not just hand them something, but something that you would keep in your files, in your research documents, that documents the informed consent that was given. Again, extra care must be taken with special populations like children or impaired subjects, depending on the nature of the impairment. There are several elements of consent that actually came out of the work that was done at the conclusion of the syphilis study to ensure that the elements of consent are consistent for all research projects. Again, talking about capacity, we've talked about that, the age of consent, as well as the ability to make to be cognitively aware enough to make that consent. Information that's part of the consent. You want to make sure the information that's provided is complete and comprehensive, and most importantly, is fully understood by the enrollees, and that the individuals understand that it is voluntary, that they have a choice to participate or withdraw at any time, and are they aware of this choice. Specifically, they're aware that even if once they give consent at the initiation of a research project, it is always their right to be able to withdraw that consent at any point when they decide they are no longer willing and to participate in the research study. And that information must be provided to them and be an element of the consent that is initially gained. Now, the research ethics has evolved since it first started to come about in the United States in the late 70s, early 80s. There are local and federal laws that govern these ethical codes that are codified in local and federal laws. The Department of Health and Human Services, through NBAC and other agencies, the FDA, have certain standards, as well as NIH, depending on what type of research you're doing. There are specific ethical codes that must be followed. And so while we're giving this general overview, it is always the researcher's responsibility to make sure that they are aware of the rules, the laws, and the regulations that govern the research in which they are involved in. So you want to make sure that you're keeping abreast of what these are, because they are changed in jurisdictions from time to time, and you want to make sure what that is. So these slides look a little bit different because I took these from another mentor who I team taught a class on ethics for many years before he retired. But this is from some of his lecture notes, and I want to keep them there to remind myself to introduce his name into this presentation, but also the good work that he did as the director of the Office of Minority Health at CDC for many years, and later as one of the directors of the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. The National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare is one of the legacies of the study. It is one of the entities that was created by a presidential decree that created the National Center for Bioethics. And this happened when President actually gave a public apology, and it took into the Clinton administration, while the Senate hearings held by Senator Kennedy actually highlighted and pinpointed the unethical nature of the study and called for it to be ended. There was never an acknowledgement by the U.S. Public Health Service of the fact that they had did something that was unjust and unethical to a group of Black men in the United States. And to his credit, and through the work of many leaders like Dr. Reuben Warren, Dr. David Satcher, Dr. Bill Jenkins, and the surviving men at that time. They were actually invited to the White House, where a formal apology was given by then President Bill Clinton, and also a resources to establish the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare on the campus of Tuskegee University. Part of what the center has done and continues to do is to be a sounding board or a resource in the research community on research ethics, public health ethics, and ethics in general as it relates to research and healthcare. And we continue to do that good work here at Tuskegee University under the leadership of Dr. David Hodge, who is the interim director of the National Center for Bioethics. And according to Bayer and Beauchamp, which was published in 2007, a book on public health ethics, they talked about ethics being a set of rules, principles, values, and ideas of a particular group of people, and the systematic study of these moral concepts and theories, typically in departments of philosophy. The later publication talks about bioethics as applied ethics focused on doctor-patient relationships and how changes in the healthcare system affect this ethical paradigm. Again, these are all frameworks and are lenses in which ethics is analyzed. And again, taken from Beauchamp and Jennings, as well as some of the work of that Dr. Warren and many other folks that have worked in the Bioethics Center since his leadership began, public health ethics is starting to arise more as a lens in which public health strives to improve the quality, functioning, and longevity of populations. As we all know, public health is the study of population health versus individuals. And it has a broad conceptual base that places emphasis on ethical problematic related to interests and health of groups and the social justice of the distribution of those societal resources for the societal rights of individuals. And we are looking more through that public health lens, through the work that's happening at the National Center for Bioethics. And so I hope you will take a moment when you have the opportunity to go to the website to look at some of the good work that is happening there, but also to take the public health ethics intensive that happens every summer. One of the other things that I wanted to raise as a significant legacy of the syphilis study that ties into the work that we're now embarking on as in maternal and child health. And it is the concept of community-based participatory research and CBR that we refer to it. I wanted to point out, because there are many people who get upset when epidemiologists and biostatisticians actually point to the syphilis study as one of the most successful studies that ever occurred in U.S. Public Health Service history. And here's the reasons, some of the reasons why. Some of the things that we continue to rely on, and many of us that are engaging in maternal and child health work in the projects that we're doing now, understand that having community participate in the research, not only from its inception, but throughout the process, is a critical piece of having that information immediately translated into helpful interventions that will be utilized. And one thing that Dr. Jenkins pointed out for me in the many times I had an opportunity to sit at his feet and listen to how his perception of public health research and the trajectory of public health ethics is he, in his own talks, would compare the syphilis study and what happened there to the many concepts and that are underlying CBPR that many people rely on today and still utilize as a viable methodology to have immediate impacts in communities. Community notification is a critical piece. that happened in the syphilis study through churches and businesses, community endorsement. You had business establishments that were actually supporting and endorsing the participation of people in this study, to include the local physicians that agreed to not offer the treatment the to the men, but also organizations like the National Medical Association that actually endorsed this as a way to be able to definitively demonstrate that that disease impact Black communities in the same or similar ways that they affect other populations. You had community advice from the Tuskegee Institute, that from the university. Again, the hospital was located on the campus of Tuskegee University, and so many people were very comfortable with taking advice from the physicians that were there. There was community consent. The Macon County Medical Society consented to this happening, actually participated with this physician in some of the studies that were happening. In some of the publications, I'm sorry, that came out of the study. There was community origination, then the Negro health movement, again, that Tuskegee experiment that set the framework and had the foundational in place in order for this study to actually be successful in a Black community. And then you had cultural competence. You had somebody that was from the community, that was already embedded in the community, that was in charge of developing strategies to ensure follow-up in these men. And so what Dr. Jenkins used to talk about when he made these types of comparisons is that something that starts out good can actually end up bad. It ain't necessarily bad at the origin. And so even though you get that conformed consent at the very beginning, you did all the right steps at the very beginning, there are things that can happen along the way of that study that can then raise issues as to the ethics and whether that project should continue. And many times, not only as researchers, but as agencies that invest in this research, because we made such a large initial investment, there's a lot of hesitancy to actually stop or get new consent when these changes happen. For instance, when the penicillin became readily available and accepted as a treatment of choice, the decision to not only have the physicians not treat these men, but also have them barred from the draft and to participate in the war, because during that time, as a soldier, they would have been given syphilis to treat, I'm sorry, given penicillin to treat the syphilis and any other diseases that penicillin is known to correct. And so even if they weren't given it for syphilis, they may have been given it for other illnesses, which will also impacted the syphilis. Now, if at that point, and when that became readily available, if informed consent was then gathered, we may have a different perspective on this study as we look back on it today. But again, I like to remind everyone that these notions of informed consent, these notions of IRBs and having people to actually monitor research progress comes out of the understanding that while people may have good intentions at the beginning of the process, there has to be some way to monitor and to ensure that those intentions do not in some way get changed based upon circumstances or choices of individuals that are not then communicated to the participants, and allowing them to continue to be informed about what's available, what the risk and the potential benefits are, and then affirmatively consent to continue participation. So I know I said a lot of words to you today, and I like to end by saying just a couple things to you that I've learned from my mentor, Dr. William Bill Jenkins, who is no longer living, but his legacy continues on. When I was head of the Department of Graduate Public Health here at Tuskegee University. I did begin the Bill Jenkins lecture series. In one of the first lectures that we had, I asked his widow, Dr. Diane Rowley, who also was a part of the commission core at CDC as an EIS officer, and was a critical piece of some of the earlier work in maternal and child health. She indicated in her presentation that while the information and the struggle that Dr. Jenkins had when he was trying to blow the whistle or shed light on what was happening at Syphilis changed his life and sensitized him and oriented his work going forward. There was another meeting that happened in 1970 that also forever changed the trajectory of Dr. Jenkins' life. In a meeting in 1970 of the American Statistical Association, ASA in Canada, Dr. Jenkins attended a panel on the status of Black Americans. One Black American was on the panel, and only 4 African American, all young men, were in the audience. Later in his life, he wrote about the anguish they felt when they realized that there were less than 5 African Americans with PhDs in either epidemiology or biostatistics. That's when Dr. Jenkins made a pact with the other men who were in attendance at that conference to complete his PhD and to make sure that there would be a workforce of African American public health experts with a cultural perspective on Black health. He considered the development of the workforce to be a social justice work that he needed to participate in. The programs he created produced over 400 public health professionals. He loved mentoring. He latched onto students, or we latched onto him. And he never let go, and we never let him go until God said different. And the standard question that he asked all of his public health students, and I so vividly remember the day he asked me this question myself. And his question was very simple, and I will leave you with this question as well. And that question is, how do you plan to change the world? Dr. Jenkins' plan was through increasing the Black public health workforce so that we can be at the table and leading some of the projects to ensure these types of atrocities do not happen again. I wish that you all could have had an opportunity to meet not only Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Warren and some of the other folks that I had the opportunity to learn from and be mentored by during my time. But you have other giants in the field that also are pouring into you. So I hope that you will take this opportunity to listen and to form those relationships that you can continue to come back to those resources throughout your career as you make a decision about how you will change the world. And I'll leave you with these links to conversations that Dr. Jenkins had on very public stages. And he walks through not only his discussions on health disparities, but also the syphilis study in his own words and how his participation in that changed his life, but also helped to change the landscape of public health in the United States. It was under the leadership that the first of Dr. Jenkins that the first public health program at a HBCU was created. And he had the ability to not only see that program, but 10 other HBCUs to have programs in public health. And again, this was all set in motion from his opportunity to participate in the things that we've talked about in this conversation. I very much wish that I could be there to entertain any questions that you may have as it relates to this, but I am probably on a plane right now while you are listening to this presentation. I am happy to make myself available to you at some point during this summer and during your process if time is available to have some further discussion about research ethics and the impact of the U.S. Public Health Service of untreated syphilis in the Negro male on the legacy and tradition of ethics and bioethics in the United States. But until then, I hope that you have an amazing, amazing experience this summer and that you will think about and focus on and start to chart out how you will make the world better. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your summer.